Populism, Progressivism, and the Great War, a time of significant reform in the United States. The Gilded Age's excesses, abuses, and corruption will be addressed through the reforms of the Progressive era. Populism was born out of the Grange movement, which actually started as a social club for farmers who were very isolated. Farmers shared their frustrations with low crop prices and the monopolized railroads, who were charging exorbitant shipping rates. Many of their early efforts failed. However, in Munn versus Illinois in 1877, the Supreme Court decided that the state's government could regulate businesses that affected public interests. Eventually, the Grange movement became the Populist Party, and Union workers joined with the farmers. The Panic of 1893 made the Populist Party a viable alternative to the two major political parties. The Panic of 1893 was a serious economic depression. Two of the largest employers in the U.S. collapsed. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and the National Cordage Company failed and caused panic in the stock market. The Populist Party platform included many reforms, including the free coinage of silver, which would have increased inflation, which would have caused crop prices to rise. They also championed reforms that would increase people's voice in government, such as the direct election of senators. In the election of 1896, the Democrats ran William Jennings Bryan against William McKinley. Bryan was a Silverist who was supported by the Populist Party. McKinley endorsed a gold standard platform, while Bryan, however, won the Democratic nomination after giving his moving Cross of Gold speech. Bryan lost the election to McKinley. Political reform came at the state level through Robert Fighting Bob La Follette. He advocated for the initiative, referendum, and recall, all which increased people's voice in government. Initiative allows a group of voters to place a piece of legislation on the ballot once they gain enough names on a petition. Referendum occurs when the voters decide to enact or deny a piece of legislation placed on the ballot. Recall allows voters to remove an elected official before his or her term has expired. When historians refer to the Progressive Era, 1900 to 1917, they are generally alluding to a period in which widespread political and social reform occurred. The reform sought to correct the corruption of the Gilded Age so that all Americans could live better lives instead of just some. During the Progressive Era, investigative reporters known as muckrakers worked to expose corporate corruption. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle about the nation's meat packing plant. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had tramped and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs. There would be meat stored in great piles in the rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the Harpers together. His book led to the passage of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which put regulations on our food and drugs. Another muckraker was Jacob Riis, a photographer who exposed the conditions of the working poor in his book How the Other Half Lives. He held showings of his photographs trying to show the wealthy of the cities the terrible inequalities. Jane Addams was a Progressive-era social reformer who worked to help immigrants in Chicago. She provided language classes, shelter, and daycare at her Chicago Hull House. Jane Addams was part of the social gospel movement, a movement that sought to ban child labor and implement safer working conditions. During the Progressive Era, there were 4 important amendments passed: the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments. The 16th Amendment was ratified February 3, 1913, and allowed the government to impose a federal income tax. The 17th Amendment was ratified on April 8, 1913, and allowed for the direct election of senators. Previously, senators were elected by the state legislature. This amendment increased people's voice in government. The 18th Amendment was ratified January 29, 1919, which banned the manufacture, transport, and sale of liquor. We will dive more into prohibition next week. But until then, you need to know the 18th Amendment was heavily influenced by women because of the effects of heavy drinking, which often included domestic abuse. A song for the grand old temperance tree, that it bear goodly fruit. Its blessings everywhere we see. We praise its branch and root. We'll plant it wherever rum shops are, in our native land so far, till its noble branches spread afar, on the golden sunny air. Oh, we'll gather round the temperance tree, and sing our songs of joy, till the viper that is in the cup shall no more destroy. Till the viper that is in the cup shall no more destroy. Again, we'll look at it more during the Roaring Twenties. The women's suffrage movement sought to gain the right to vote. Women were considered second-class citizens. They lacked the right to vote, could not serve on juries, or hold public office. Once married, women lost control of their property. In 1848, a group of like-minded people met at Seneca Falls, New York. They held a convention and passed a resolution called the Declaration of Sentiments. They met to declare women should have the right to vote, which women would not have until 1920. Susan B. Anthony was a champion for women's rights. She attempted to vote in many Western elections and founded the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Finally, on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. The amendment allowed women to have influence on the government. You can tell from the political cartoon that it was a long journey to get national suffrage for women and to get the states to ratify this amendment. So, help me to keep them pure. Please vote against the sale of liquors. That one would be the 18th. The United States Senate, direct election of senators. 17th. Women work, women vote. 19th. And I want you to pay your taxes. 16th. We had 3 Progressive era presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Theodore Roosevelt was president from 1901 to 1908. At 42, he was the youngest president to take the oath of office. He became president after William McKinley was assassinated. His presidency became known for trust busting, and he promised Americans a square deal. He wanted to protect consumers from corrupt business practices. Roosevelt endorsed William Howard Taft, and he won against William Jennings Bryan. Taft's more moderate policies caused him to fall out with Roosevelt. This spurred Roosevelt to form the Bull Moose Party and run as a third party in the election of 1912. This split the vote and led to the election of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson called his platform New Freedom. Under his leadership, Congress enacted several reforms. Banking policy was completely redirected into the Federal Reserve System, and during his administration, Congress also passed the 16th Amendment, or the graduated income tax. He also dealt with World War I from 1914 to 1918, known as the Great War. The Progressive era ended with the First World War. When we look at the causes of World War I, we can remember the word mania: militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and an assassination. The first 4 built the fire, and the last was the spark that ignited a powder keg. In 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Gavrilo Princip was a 19-year-old member of the Black Hand, an organization that was working for the liberation of Serbia. The assassination caused a ripple effect throughout Europe. Germany was allied with Hungary, and Russia was allied with Serbia. Britain and France were allied with Russia, and all of it brought Europe to war. Great Britain, France, Russia, and later the U.S. were the Allied powers. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire were the Central Powers. The United States stayed neutral until Germany's aggressive actions brought them in 1917. The British had blockaded Germany, and Austria-Hungary in order to starve them into submission. Germany reacted by sending out U-boats to search out and destroy British ships. This unrestricted submarine warfare began to affect the United States. When the British passenger ship, the Lusitania, was sunk by a German U-boat, 128 Americans were killed. When Germany announced they would sink any ship headed to Britain, Wilson broke diplomatic ties with Germany. After the sinking of the Lusitania, the interception of the Zimmermann telegram intensified the situation. Germany offered Mexico the return of previously held territories if they would attack the United States. So in April 1917, Woodrow Wilson asked for a declaration of war. The U.S. established the Selective Service Act to enlarge the military, and millions of Americans registered for the draft. The U.S. government formed the Committee of Public Information, produced wartime propaganda to encourage patriotism, and most Americans responded with waves of patriotism and increased hostility to anything German. Congress then passed the Espionage and Sabotage Act to hunt down suspected radicals. The war cost upwards of $30 billion. In order to pay for the war, the government enacted higher taxes and sold war bonds, as you can see from many of these World War I advertisements, encouraged patriotism by buying war bonds to help fund the war. African Americans served in segregated units, mostly as support troops during World War I, but several did see actions against the German, and many went into factories and helped the women at home while men were fighting overseas. We're going to learn a great deal about African American patriotism during our World War II lessons. At the end of the war, Wilson came up with his 14 points, in which he was trying to make the world safe for democracy. He wanted each country to be independent and have their own form of government, and he called for freedom of the seas. He wanted no more secret alliances and to reform countries based on nationalities, and above all, he wanted to create the League of Nations, a group that would work together internationally to stave off the threat of war. The League of Nations would promote peace and try to prevent war, but many thought it was just too big a job for one organization. They'd be responsible for resolving international conflict and problems. And in the end, every country joined except the United States and Russia. Russia had just experienced a revolution of its own in 1917. The U.S. did not join because many in America felt like the League of Nations would pull us into unnecessary war, and we were moving back towards neutrality and isolationism. Wilson needed 2/3 to ratify the treaty, and it was not ratified, so the compromise was rejected. We ended up not even signing the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty to end the war with Germany. Germany was forced to pay money called reparations, give up land, and give up their military. It was an exorbitantly high amount of money that would send Germany into its own Great Depression. Germany lost its territories. It was also forced to take the war guilt for the war and accept blame, and they were forced to disarm their military. Many believe that it's the harsh treatment from the Treaty of Versailles that led to the situation that would put us into World War II.